Hey guys, tonight we begin with temple slavery in ancient Egypt. And no, it wasn't what you're picturing from Hollywood movies with dramatic whipping scenes and Charlton Heston. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together, because what I'm about to tell you about daily life in an Egyptian temple will completely flip your understanding of what it meant to be enslaved to the gods. Let's start with the biggest misconception about temple slaves in ancient Egypt. Picture this: you probably imagine chains, whips, brutal overseers, and people being worked to death building pyramids while crying out to their gods for salvation. In reality, temple slaves were more like religious civil servants with really long employment contracts. And by long, I mean lifelong, non-negotiable contracts that came with surprisingly decent benefits. Think of it like being permanently employed by the world's wealthiest corporation, except instead of stock options, you got guaranteed meals, housing, and the divine protection of gods who could supposedly control the Nile's flooding. Not exactly Amazon warehouse conditions, but not Club Med either. This wasn't some idealistic religious commune where everyone sang hymns and shared bread in peaceful harmony. It was a complex economic and spiritual machine that happened to run on human labor that couldn't quit. Temple slaves weren't just random people grabbed off the street. Many were prisoners of war, debtors, or people who had been dedicated to the temple as children by families who couldn't afford to feed them. Some were even volunteers, yes, volunteers, who chose temple service over starvation or homelessness. The temple wasn't just a place of worship. It was essentially ancient Egypt's equivalent of a Fortune 500 company, complete with manufacturing, agriculture, real estate, and financial services. Unlike any major corporation, it needed workers who couldn't just walk away when the work got tedious or the boss got cranky. The difference was, instead of golden handcuffs, they used actual religious obligations and legal bondage. The New Kingdom period, roughly 1550 to 1070 BCE, was ancient Egypt's equivalent of the Gilded Age. If the Gilded Age had been run by people who genuinely believed their CEO was a living god, Egypt wasn't some backwards desert kingdom struggling to survive. It was a sophisticated superpower with complex international trade, advanced engineering, and bureaucracy that would make modern government offices weep with envy. The temples controlled absolutely massive wealth. We're talking about institutions that owned roughly 1/3 of all cultivated land in Egypt, along with workshops, mines, trading operations, and enough livestock to feed small cities. If you thought Amazon had a monopoly on everything, the Temple of Amun-Ra basically had a monopoly on the afterlife, which was considerably more valuable real estate in ancient Egyptian mines. These temples weren't quaint little chapels, where the local priest blessed marriages and gave moral guidance on Sundays. They were massive complexes that functioned as economic powerhouses, employing thousands of people in roles ranging from basic laborers to highly skilled artisans, administrators, and specialists. The Temple of Karnak alone covered over 200 acres and had more employees than most modern corporations. The pharaoh might have been the theoretical ruler of Egypt, but the temples held the real economic power. They controlled trade routes, managed agricultural production, ran manufacturing operations, and essentially functioned as the ancient world's version of multinational conglomerates, and just like modern corporations, they needed a reliable workforce that wouldn't jump ship when a competitor offered better working conditions. If you thought medieval serfs had it rough being tied to the land, consider that temple slaves were tied not just to their workplace, but to their employers for eternity. Literally, their service didn't end with death. Their souls were expected to continue serving the gods in the afterlife. It was the ultimate non-compete clause. The legal system backing this up was surprisingly sophisticated. Contracts, property rights, inheritance laws, and detailed record-keeping meant that temple slavery wasn't just some barbaric free-for-all. It was institutionalized, bureaucratized, and thoroughly documented. Because nothing says advanced civilization, meticulously organized oppression. Meet Khaemwaset, not the famous prince, but a temple slave whose name we actually know, thanks to Egyptian record-keeping that was more thorough than most modern HR departments. Khaemwaset worked in the Temple of Ptah in Memphis, and his daily routine would have made a modern shift worker feel both grateful for labor laws and oddly nostalgic for job security. Khaemwaset's background was typical of many temple slaves. His father had been a soldier who died in one of Egypt's many military campaigns, leaving behind debts that the family couldn't pay. Rather than lose everything, Khaemwaset's mother made a deal with the temple. Her son's lifelong service in exchange for debt forgiveness and a guarantee that the family wouldn't starve. But here's where it gets interesting. Khaemwaset wasn't just some generic laborer. He was trained as a scribe, which in ancient Egypt was like being given a law degree and an MBA rolled into one. He could read, write, calculate, and manage complex inventories. He knew religious protocols, legal procedures, and could probably run administrative operations that would challenge modern middle managers. His typical day started before dawn, not because of some sadistic overseer with a whip, but because temple operations began with the morning rituals that had to be performed at precise times. The gods, apparently, were very particular about scheduling. Khaemwaset would help prepare the daily offerings, manage inventory for the temple's various operations, handle correspondence with other temples and government officials, and oversee other workers who were, technically, even lower on the hierarchy than he was. The contradiction. This slave had his own living quarters, received regular food rations that were actually quite good by ancient standards, had access to medical care, and could even own personal property. He couldn't leave, and he couldn't negotiate his salary, but he lived better than many free farmers and laborers. He was essentially middle management in a religious corporation, except his employment contract had been signed by the gods themselves. Khaemwaset even had what we might recognize as career advancement opportunities. Skilled temple slaves could rise through the ranks, gaining more responsibility, better living conditions, and increased respect within the temple hierarchy. Some became overseers of other slaves, temple administrators, or specialized craftsmen whose skills were highly valued. The really twisted part. Khaemwaset's children would automatically become temple slaves too. It was a hereditary position, passed down like a family business, except the business was eternal servitude, and you couldn't sell your shares or retire to Florida. And if you think that's complicated, wait until you hear about how temple slaves could sometimes earn enough money through side work to eventually buy their freedom. Except many chose not to, because life outside the temple was often more uncertain and dangerous than life within it. This wasn't just about one person's daily routine, or even about labor practices in ancient Egypt. Temple slavery represented the intersection of religious belief, economic necessity, and social control in one of history's most sophisticated civilizations. These weren't just workers, they were human resources in the most literal sense. People whose entire existence was considered a resource owned by divine entities. The implications rippled through every aspect of Egyptian society. Families made decisions about their children's futures based on temple labor needs. Economic policies were shaped by temple's requirements for workers. Military campaigns often focused on capturing people who could be put to work in temple operations. International trade agreements included provisions for exchanging human labor. This system affected everyone, from the pharaoh, who needed temple's economic support to maintain power, to free farmers who competed with temple agricultural operations, to merchants who relied on temple-produced goods for their businesses. If you were born in ancient Egypt, your life was shaped by this institution, whether you ever set foot in a temple or not. The human cost was enormous. Generations of people whose choices, ambitions, and freedom were sacrificed to maintain religious and economic systems, yet the system was so embedded in Egyptian culture that many participants, including slaves themselves, saw it as natural and even beneficial. They weren't just accepting oppression, they were buying into a worldview that made their servitude seem spiritually meaningful and economically rational. The modern parallels are uncomfortable to consider. How many of our own economic and social systems depend on people having limited choices? How often do we rationalize inequality by calling it necessary for the greater good? But Khaemwaset's relatively comfortable existence was just one face of temple slavery. His position as a literate administrator put him in the upper tier of temple workers, with privileges and protections that weren't available to everyone wearing the metaphorical collar of divine service. The system had layers within layers, hierarchies within hierarchies, and contradictions that would make modern corporate structure charts look simple by comparison. Some temple slaves lived lives that free citizens might envy, while others experienced conditions that matched our worst stereotypes about ancient slavery. To understand how this all worked, and why it worked for over 1,000 years, we need to dig deeper into the daily realities of temple life. We need to see how the morning rituals that governed Khaemwaset's schedule were part of a larger machine that transformed human labor into divine favor, and how that transformation justified everything from individual servitude to imperial conquest. The temple bells that woke Khaemwaset each morning weren't just calling him to work, they were summoning him to participate in a system that turned human beings into offerings to the gods. The daily routine of temple slavery wasn't just about getting up early and following orders. It was about participating in what ancient Egyptians believed was the literal maintenance of cosmic order. Unlike our modern assumption that religious work was somehow separate from real work, temple slaves were essentially cosmic maintenance workers whose job was to keep the universe from falling apart. Every single task, from sweeping floors to copying religious texts, was considered essential to maintaining the divine principle of truth, justice, and cosmic balance. Miss a step in the morning ritual, the sun might not rise properly. Forget to properly clean the god's statue. Divine favor could be withdrawn from the entire kingdom. Talk about job pressure. This wasn't superstitious busy work dreamed up by lazy priests who wanted someone else to do their chores. The Egyptians had developed a sophisticated theological framework that made every mundane task spiritually significant. It was like having a job where your daily performance reviews were conducted by the forces that controlled the afterlife, the annual flood, and whether your enemies would conquer your civilization. The temple operated on what we might call divine time as schedules that were determined not by human convenience or economic efficiency, but by astronomical events, religious calendars, and mythological cycles. Temple slaves didn't work 9 to 5. They worked on cosmic time, which meant their daily routine was dictated by the movements of stars, the phases of the moon, and the complex relationships between dozens of different gods who apparently had very specific preferences about when and how they wanted to be worshipped. This created a work environment that was simultaneously more meaningful and more oppressive than anything we can easily imagine today. Every task mattered on a cosmic level, but that also meant that every task was subject to religious scrutiny and divine judgment. Take the morning awakening ritual, which wasn't just the temple's version of opening for business. It was literally waking up the god who lived in the temple's inner sanctuary. Temple slaves would begin before dawn, preparing the offerings, purify the sacred spaces, and getting everything ready for the moment when the high priest would enter the god's chamber and perform the daily ritual that kept the deity conscious and active. Amenhotep was a temple slave whose specific job was maintaining the god's wardrobe. And yes, the statues of gods had extensive wardrobes that needed daily attention. He would carefully dress and undress the god's statue, applying oils and perfumes, adjusting jewelry, and making sure every fold of cloth was perfect. One surviving record mentions that Amenhotep once spent 3 hours adjusting a god's collar because it wasn't hanging at the correct angle, and the priests were concerned that improper divine fashion didn't offend the deity. The absurdity of grown adults obsessing over a statue's outfit was balanced by the genuine terror of what might happen if they got it wrong. Egyptian religious texts are full of stories about gods withdrawing their protection from temples that didn't maintain proper standards. When your job security depends on keeping a statue happy, you take that statue very seriously indeed. Another temple slave, Seneb, worked in what was essentially the temple's restaurant, preparing the elaborate meals that were offered to the gods multiple times each day. These weren't simple offerings of bread and beer. They were complex, multi-course meals that had to be prepared according to specific recipes, presented on particular types of dishes, and arranged in precise patterns that reflected religious symbolism. Seneb's day involved butchering animals, baking dozens of different types of bread, brewing beer, preparing fruits and vegetables, and creating elaborate food displays that would make modern wedding caterers weep with exhaustion. The food was prepared as if the gods were actually going to eat it, because as far as everyone involved was concerned, they were, after the gods had consumed the spiritual essence of the food. The physical remains were distributed among temple personnel according to strict hierarchies. High priests got the best cuts of meat, lower-ranking priests got decent portions, and slaves like Seneb got whatever was left over. It was a system that literally fed everyone, but made sure everyone knew their place in the cosmic order while they ate. One particularly memorable incident involves Seneb accidentally dropping a tray of sacred bread, which required not just cleaning up the mess and preparing new bread, but also performing purification rituals, offering apologies to the offended deity, and having his supervisor perform divination to determine whether the god had forgiven the transgression. Modern workplace accidents require filling out incident reports. Temple workplace accidents required consulting the divine will. The temple workshops were another world entirely. Skilled craftsmen who happened to be slaves created some of the finest art and luxury goods in the ancient world. They worked with gold, silver, precious stones, and exotic materials imported from across the known world. Their workshops produced everything from jewelry and furniture to weapons and ceremonial objects. These craftsmen lived in a strange contradiction. They were legally enslaved, but their skills made them incredibly valuable. They lived better than many free citizens, had access to the finest materials and tools, and created objects that would be treasured for thousands of years. Yet they couldn't leave, couldn't negotiate their working conditions, and couldn't pass their workshops to their children as independent businesses. But it wasn't that simple. Nothing involving ancient Egypt ever was. The line between slave and free worker was often blurrier than legal documents suggested. Some temple slaves earned money through freelance work during their off hours, accumulated enough wealth to live comfortably, and even employed other people to help with their assigned temple duties. Meanwhile, some supposedly free workers were bound to the temple by debts, family obligations, or religious vows that made their situations barely distinguishable from outright slavery. The temple's economic tentacles reached into every aspect of Egyptian society, creating webs of obligation and dependency that made simple categories like slave and free almost meaningless. There were also significant differences between male and female temple slaves. Women could hold certain religious positions that were close to men, including some roles that came with considerable authority and respect. Female temple slaves could become priestesses, temple musicians, or sacred dancers, positions that carried spiritual significance and social status. Even if they didn't come with legal freedom, some temple slaves were essentially indentured servants working off specific debts or obligations, with the possibility of eventual freedom. Others were permanently enslaved through inheritance, military capture, or religious dedication. The temple maintained detailed records of each person's status, but the practical differences in their daily lives weren't always obvious to outsiders. The most complicated cases involved people who had been dedicated to the temple as children by their families. They had grown up knowing no other life, were thoroughly trained in religious and administrative duties, and often held positions of significant responsibility within the temple hierarchy. Were they slaves who had been given good careers, or were they professionals who happened to be legally owned by a religious institution? Modern analogies break down because we don't have good examples of institutions that combine religious authority, economic power, and legal ownership of human beings in the way that Egyptian temples did. The closest parallels might be medieval monasteries, corporate company towns, or military service, but none of these quite capture the unique combination of spiritual significance, economic necessity, and personal bondage that defined temple slavery. The result was a system that was simultaneously more humane and more oppressive than simple slavery. Temple slaves often lived better, ate better, and had more security than free workers, but they paid for these benefits with their fundamental human autonomy. They were well-fed prisoners in golden cages, with the added psychological burden of believing that their imprisonment was spiritually necessary. Different people responded to this situation in predictably human ways. Some embraced their roles, finding genuine meaning and satisfaction in their religious work. They developed fierce loyalty to their temples and took pride in their contributions to divine service. These were the temple slaves who rose through the ranks, earned respect and responsibility, and lived lives that many free citizens might envy. Others went through the motions while mentally checking out, doing the minimum required to avoid punishment. While emotionally detaching from their circumstances, they found ways to create personal space and autonomy within the system's constraints, developing their own social networks, hobbies, and sources of meaning that existed parallel to their official duties. A few actively resisted, though outright rebellion was rare and usually unsuccessful. More common were subtle forms of resistance, working slowly, accidentally damaging valuable items, or finding ways to bend temple rules without technically breaking them. The temple's detailed record-keeping actually helps us identify some of these acts of quiet rebellion, preserved in disciplinary records that list various forms of negligence and disrespect. The institutional response was sophisticated management rather than brutal oppression. Temple administrators understood that their operations depended on maintaining a workforce that was productive, skilled, and relatively content. Harsh punishment was reserved for serious offenses. Most discipline involved additional duties, reduced privileges, or religious counseling designed to help slaves better appreciate their spiritual responsibilities. The temples also developed elaborate reward systems to encourage good performance and loyalty. Outstanding slaves could receive better housing, additional food rations, opportunities for advancement, or even limited freedoms, like the ability to visit family members or participate in festivals outside the temple grounds. Long-term implications included the creation of multi-generational temple communities where families had served the same institutions for centuries. These communities developed their own cultures, traditions, and social structures that existed within and alongside the broader temple hierarchy. Children grew up expecting to follow their parents' careers, and many never seriously considered any alternative way of life. Meanwhile, the daily routine that structured Khaemwaset's life was being replicated across hundreds of temples throughout Egypt, creating a vast network of religious economic enterprises that employed tens of thousands of people in various forms of bondage. Each temple had its own specific requirements, traditions, and working conditions, but all operated according to the same basic principles that made human labor a form of divine offering. The mourning rituals that woke temple slaves across Egypt weren't just local religious observances. They were part of a coordinated system of worship that the Egyptians believed maintained cosmic order. Every temple's daily operations contributed to a larger spiritual machine that kept the universe functioning properly. The Nile flooding on schedule, and Egypt's enemies at bay. Understanding how this system worked requires looking beyond individual stories like Khaemwaset's to see the broader patterns of organization, control, and meaning that made temple slavery both economically profitable and spiritually meaningful. The bells that called slaves to their morning duties weren't just marking time. They were announcing the beginning of another day's work in humanity's most ambitious attempt to industrialize the divine. But the spiritual significance of temple work was only one layer of a much more complex system. The temple's economic power depended on sophisticated production and distribution networks that turned religious devotion into actual wealth. And that's where things get really interesting. If the spiritual maintenance of cosmic order was ancient Egypt's version of essential services, then the economic operations of temple slavery were their version of Amazon, Walmart, and Wall Street rolled into one divinely sanctioned monopoly. The temples weren't just religious institutions that happened to need workers. They were economic powerhouses that used religious authority to justify what was essentially the ancient world's most successful business model. While Khaemwaset was carefully managing religious inventories and maintaining divine schedules, thousands of other temple slaves were running agricultural operations, manufacturing luxury goods, operating trading networks, and managing financial services that would make modern corporations envious. The temples had figured out how to turn prayer into profit on an industrial scale, and they needed a workforce that couldn't quit, couldn't unionize, and couldn't negotiate for better working conditions. This economic dimension of temple slavery created a parallel universe where people who were legally property nonetheless operated complex businesses, managed substantial resources, and made decisions that affected Egypt's entire economy. They were simultaneously powerless and powerful, owning nothing while controlling everything. Slaves who lived better than many free business owners. The contradiction was built into the system. The temples needed highly skilled, trustworthy, motivated workers to run their economic operations, but they also needed workers who couldn't leave with their knowledge, skills, or business relationships. Temple slavery solved this problem by creating a class of people who were legally bound to their employers, but economically essential to their operations. Think of it as the ultimate non-compete agreement. Not only couldn't you quit to work for a competitor, you couldn't quit at all, ever, for any reason. But in exchange, you got job security that was literally guaranteed by the gods, comprehensive benefits, and career opportunities that weren't available anywhere else in the ancient world. Consider the case of Hui, a temple slave who managed the agricultural operations for the Temple of Sobek in the Fayum region. Hui wasn't working small garden plots behind the temple. He was overseeing thousands of acres of farmland, managing seasonal labor crews of hundreds of workers, coordinating irrigation systems, and handling agricultural trade that supplied food for multiple cities. Huey's daily routine involved making decisions that modern agricultural managers would recognize: which crops to plant where, how to allocate water resources, when to harvest different fields, how to store and transport grain, and how to balance immediate consumption needs against long-term storage requirements. He negotiated with suppliers, managed budgets, supervised foremen, and reported regularly to temple administrators who expected detailed accounts of agricultural productivity. The twist: Hui couldn't own any of the land he managed, couldn't keep any profits from his successful farming operations, and couldn't leave to start his own agricultural business, even though he had decades of experience and extensive business relationships throughout the region. He was essentially running a multi-million-dollar agricultural operation in modern terms, while being legally classified as farm equipment himself. Yet Hui lived in a comfortable house on temple grounds, had his own household staff, who were also temple slaves, ate better food than most free farmers, and exercised more real authority over agricultural decisions than many people who technically own their own farms. His children were being educated in temple schools and trained for administrative positions within the temple hierarchy. In practical terms, he lived like a successful businessman. In legal terms, he was chattel property. Another fascinating example was Nefertiti, not the famous queen, but a temple slave whose name happened to coincide, who ran the textile operations for the Temple of Hathor at Dendra. Her workshops produced some of the finest linen in Egypt, using techniques and materials that were closely guarded trade secrets. The temple's textiles were exported throughout the Mediterranean, generating enormous profits that helped fund temple construction projects and religious festivals. Nefertiti supervised teams of weavers, dyers, and seamstresses who created everything from simple everyday cloth to elaborate ceremonial garments decorated with gold thread and precious stones. She coordinated with suppliers who imported exotic dyes and materials from Africa and Asia, managed quality control for products that bore the temple's reputation, and innovated new techniques that improved both the quality and efficiency of textile production. Her workshops were essentially fashion houses that created luxury goods for Egypt's elite, but they were staffed entirely by people who couldn't leave, couldn't start competing businesses, and couldn't demand higher wages, no matter how skilled they became or how much profit their work generated. It was capitalism without labor mobility, innovation without entrepreneurial rewards, and skilled craftsmanship without economic freedom. The most complex example might be Jehuti, who managed international trading operations for the Temple of Amun at Thebes. Jehuti coordinated trading expeditions that traveled as far as Punt, modern Somalia, and Mesopotamia, bringing back exotic goods that were either used in temple ceremonies or sold for massive profits in Egyptian markets. His responsibilities included organizing expeditions, negotiating with foreign merchants, managing currency exchanges, maintaining diplomatic relationships with foreign officials, and ensuring that temple trading operations generated the maximum possible returns. He spoke several languages, understood international law and customs, and had business relationships throughout the known world. Jehuti traveled extensively, lived in luxury accommodations, dined with foreign dignitaries, and made decisions that affected Egypt's international relationships. Yet he remained legally a slave who could theoretically be sold, punished, or reassigned at his master's whim. He was simultaneously one of Egypt's most important international businessmen and a piece of temple property with no legal rights or protections. The human drama in these stories comes from the psychological contradictions they created. These were people who exercised real power and authority in their professional lives, while having no control over their personal circumstances. They made decisions that affected thousands of people, while being unable to make basic decisions about their own lives and futures. This wasn't isolated to a few exceptional cases. The pattern repeated throughout Egypt's temple system. Temples systematically identified people with valuable skills or potential, acquired them through various legal mechanisms, and then developed those skills, while ensuring the people could never use their expertise independently. The pattern worked because it solves several problems simultaneously. Temples needed skilled workers, but couldn't afford to lose those workers to competitors. They needed people who could be trusted with valuable resources and sensitive information, but couldn't risk those people starting their own businesses or sharing trade secrets. They needed managers who understood their operations intimately, but couldn't allow those managers to become independent power centers. Temple slavery created artificial scarcity in skilled labor by removing the most talented people from the general labor market. This drove up the value of the temple's human resources, while simultaneously making it difficult for independent businesses to compete with temple operations. It was economic warfare disguised as religious devotion. The social and economic factors that enabled this system were complex, but remarkably stable. Egypt's legal system recognized and enforced various forms of human bondage, making it possible for temples to acquire and hold skilled workers legally. The religious authority of temples made their claims to own human beings seem legitimate and even morally justified. The economic benefits of temple operations created incentives for rulers to support and protect the system. Other civilizations had slavery, but few developed the sophisticated management techniques that Egyptian temples used to maximize the productivity of enslaved skilled workers. The Egyptians figured out how to create artificial loyalty through religious indoctrination, artificial motivation through hierarchical advancement opportunities, and artificial job satisfaction through meaningful work assignments. The pattern was so successful that it persisted for over 1,000 years with remarkably little modification. Different dynasties came and went, Foreign invasions disrupted political systems, and economic conditions changed dramatically. But the basic structure of temple slavery remained consistent because it worked so well for everyone except the slaves themselves. Comparison to other time periods and places reveals how unique this system was. Medieval European serfs were tied to land, but could eventually buy their freedom. Roman slaves could earn or purchase manumission. Chinese bonded laborers served for specific time periods. Egyptian temple slaves were bound by religious obligations that theoretically extended into the afterlife, making their bondage literally eternal. The effects of this economic system rippled through every aspect of Egyptian society. Free workers found themselves competing against temple operations that had access to skilled labor, that couldn't demand wages, couldn't leave for better opportunities, and couldn't start competing businesses. Independent craftsmen, farmers, and merchants were systematically disadvantaged by institutions that could exploit human resources without normal labor costs. The beneficiaries were obvious: temple administrators, priests, and the religious hierarchy accumulated enormous wealth and power, but the benefits extended beyond the temples themselves. Rulers received political support from powerful religious institutions. Upper-class Egyptians had access to luxury goods and services that were produced by temple slave labor. Even ordinary citizens benefited from temple economic activities that contributed to Egypt's overall prosperity. The costs were equally clear. Thousands of talented, skilled people were prevented from achieving their full economic potential or making independent choices about their lives and careers. Entire families were trapped in hereditary bondage that limited their children's opportunities and futures. Egyptian society lost the innovations and entrepreneurship that might have emerged from a more competitive and mobile labor market. Unintended consequences included the creation of powerful temple institutions that eventually challenged royal authority. Some temples became so wealthy and influential that they functioned as semi-independent political entities with their own armies, territories, and international relationships. The economic success of temple slavery created religious organizations that were sometimes more powerful than the government itself. The system also created technological and economic stagnation in some areas. When you have access to unlimited, skilled labor that can't leave, there's less incentive to develop labor-saving innovations or more efficient production methods. Some historians argue that temple slavery actually slowed Egypt's economic development by reducing incentives for technological advancement. Modern parallels include various forms of corporate bondage, debt peonage, and systems that trap skilled workers in exploitative employment relationships. The ancient Egyptian model of using institutional authority to justify economic exploitation has been replicated in different forms throughout history, from company towns to modern human trafficking operations. The long-term historical impact was the demonstration that sophisticated economic systems could be built on skilled slave labor, providing a model that other civilizations studied and sometimes adopted. The organizational techniques developed by Egyptian temples influenced later religious and economic institutions throughout the ancient world. Yet even as temple slaves like Hui, Nefertiti, and Jehuti were building Egypt's economic empire through their enforced labor, the system was creating internal tensions that would eventually threaten its stability. The more successful the economic operations became, the more complex the management challenges grew, and the more difficult it became to maintain the fiction that highly skilled, economically essential people were just religious offerings to the gods. The temple's economic success attracted attention from rulers who wanted to control temple resources for their own purposes. International trade relationships created dependencies that sometimes conflicted with religious obligations. The skilled slaves who ran temple operations began to understand their own value and importance in ways that made them less willing to accept their legal status as property. What had started as a system for maintaining cosmic order through human sacrifice was evolving into something much more complex and potentially unstable. The daily routines that structured temple slaves' lives were becoming the foundation for economic and political changes that no one had anticipated when the system was first established. The morning bells that called slaves like Khaemwaset to their duties were about to become the sound of an empire reaching the limits of what organized religious exploitation could achieve. But before we get to those limits, we need to understand the moments when the system faced its greatest challenges, and how those challenges revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of industrialized divine authority taught by the reign of Ramesses III around 1184 to 1153 BCE. The temple slavery system had reached a breaking point that nobody saw coming, not because the system was failing, but because it was succeeding too well. The temples had become so wealthy and powerful that they controlled more resources than the pharaoh himself, employed more people than the royal administration, and had developed economic interests that sometimes conflicted with state policy. The crisis wasn't a slave rebellion or a moral awakening about human rights. It was a power struggle between competing institutions that both depended on enslaved human labor, but couldn't agree on who got to exploit which people in which ways. Think of it as a corporate merger gone wrong. Except the corporations involved claimed divine authority, and the hostile takeover involved armies, assassinations, and threats of cosmic retribution. The Temple of Amun Thebes had become particularly problematic. Its high priests controlled vast agricultural estates, international trading networks, and manufacturing operations that generated more revenue than most small countries. The temples. Slaves weren't just maintaining religious rituals. They were running a parallel economy that operated according to religious law rather than royal authority. Ramesses III found himself in the bizarre position of being the most powerful person in Egypt while being economically dependent on institutions that were technically his subjects but practically his rivals. The temples provided loans to the royal government, supplied materials for military campaigns, and controlled trade relationships that were essential to Egypt's international standing. Yet they were managed by people who answered to gods rather than kings, and staffed by workers who couldn't be reassigned, dismissed, or relocated according to state needs. The immediate trigger for crisis was a series of military campaigns that required massive resources, just as several bad flood years had reduced agricultural productivity. Ramesses needed to mobilize Egypt's entire economic capacity for war, but the temples claimed that their religious obligations took precedence over military necessity. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test whether Egypt was ruled by its pharaoh or by its gods, and the people caught in the middle were thousands of temple slaves whose daily routines were about to become battlegrounds in a struggle for control of an empire. The crisis exploded during what historians call the Great Temple Inventory Crisis of Year 8, which sounds boring until you realize it involved armed standoffs, accusations of divine treason, and threats to overthrow the cosmic order. The immediate issue was Ramesses III's demand that all temples provide detailed inventories of their resources, so the state could temporarily requisition materials needed for military campaigns against the Sea Peoples. The Temple of Ammon's response was essentially ancient Egypt's version of come and take it. The high priest Ramesses, yes, he was named after previous pharaohs, which tells you something about temple political ambitions, declared that temple resources belonged to the gods, not the state, and that any attempt to seize divine property would result in cosmic catastrophe. This wasn't just political posturing. The temple's economic power made their resistance a genuine threat to royal authority. What happened next reads like a corporate thriller written by people who genuinely believed in divine intervention. Ramesses III sent royal inspectors to conduct forcible inventories of temple holdings, essentially auditing the gods. The temples responded by mobilizing their own security forces, because of course wealthy religious institutions had private armies, and declaring that royal officials were committing sacrilege by touching sacred property. The standoff reached peak absurdity at the Temple of Ptah in Memphis, where our old friend Khaemwaset found himself literally caught between two sets of armed guards, arguing about whether the pharaoh or the gods owned the gold he was responsible for inventorying. Royal officials demanded access to temple treasuries, temple guards blocked their entry, and slaves like Khaemwaset were ordered by both sides to either cooperate with the inspection or protect divine property from desecration. Khaemwaset's account, preserved in a temple archive that probably shouldn't have survived, describes the surreal experience of trying to maintain normal temple operations while armed men argued about divine property rights in the background. He wrote, "The morning offerings proceeded as usual, though we could hear shouting from the treasury courtyard, where the king's men insisted that Ptah's gold belonged to Pharaoh's war, and our priests insisted that Pharaoh's war belonged to Ptah's protection. The gods' breakfast became quite cold during the theological discussions. The situation escalated when temple slaves began receiving contradictory orders. Royal officials commanded them to cooperate with state inventories, threatening punishment for obstruction of royal authority. Temple administrators ordered them to protect sacred property, threatening divine punishment for sacrilege. Some slaves, caught between earthly and divine authority, suffered what we might recognize as nervous breakdowns from the impossible choice between temporal and eternal consequences. The most dramatic moment came when a royal inspector tried to forcibly open a sealed chamber in the Temple of Ammon that allegedly contained sacred objects to wholly for human eyes. The temple slaves were ordered to physically prevent the inspection, setting up a situation where people legally owned by the state were being commanded to defy state authority in order to protect the religious institution that claimed to own their souls. The inspector, a man named Amenhotep, apparently a popular name for people in impossible situations, found himself facing a human wall of temple slaves who were literally shaking with terror, not of him, but of the cosmic consequences of allowing him to proceed. According to surviving records, he spent several hours trying to convince enslaved people to disobey their religious masters in favor of their legal owners, while the slaves tried to explain that their eternal souls were more important than their temporal legal status. The standoff was resolved in the most Egyptian way possible, through bureaucracy and theological compromise. A committee of priests, royal officials, and scribes was established to determine which temple resources were essential for cosmic maintenance and therefore untouchable, versus which were materially beneficial but spiritually optional and therefore available for military requisition. This required examining every single item in every temple inventory and classifying it according to complex theological and legal criteria. Temple slaves found themselves giving depositions about the spiritual significance of various tools, materials, and stored goods, essentially testifying in a cosmic court case about whether the gods needed specific items more than the pharaohs. Army did. The process took months and generated thousands of documents that read like the world's most surreal accounting records. Sample entries include sacred golden chalice, essential for daily offerings, untouchable, and golden chalice, similar to above, but used for backup purposes, spiritually valuable, but not essential, available for military use. Khaemwaset found himself testifying about the cosmic necessity of various writing materials, explaining to royal officials why some papyrus was too sacred to use for military correspondence, while other papyrus was sufficiently secular for state purposes. His testimony, which survives in fragmentary form, includes the wonderfully dry observation that the gods are apparently more particular about writing surfaces than His Majesty's generals. The response to this crisis revealed the fundamental contradictions in a system that tried to combine religious authority, economic power, and human bondage in a single institutional framework. Different groups reacted according to their own interests and worldviews, creating a complex mess that satisfied nobody, while somehow avoiding complete system collapse. Ramesses III emerged from the crisis with a technical victory that was practically a defeat. He got some temple resources for his military campaigns, but only after months of negotiations that demonstrated the limits of royal authority and established precedents for temple resistance to state demands. Future pharaohs would remember that the temples couldn't be simply commanded. They had to be negotiated with as semi-independent powers. The temple hierarchy learned that their economic success had made them political targets, but also that their religious authority provided effective protection against state interference. They began developing more sophisticated legal and theological arguments for temple autonomy, essentially creating the ancient world's first comprehensive theories of religious institutional independence. The immediate political fallout included the creation of new bureaucratic positions, specifically designed to manage temple-state relations. A new class of officials emerged whose job was mediating between religious and royal authority, essentially ancient Egypt's first church-state separation specialists. These officials had to be experts in both religious law and state policy, creating career opportunities for people who could navigate competing institutional loyalties. Temple slaves experienced the crisis as a period of profound uncertainty about their fundamental loyalties and obligations. Many had grown up believing that service to the temples was both legally required and spiritually meaningful, but the crisis forced them to confront the possibility that religious and state authority might conflict in ways that made their position impossible. Some slaves used the confusion to assert limited forms of independence, arguing that conflicting orders from temple and state authorities created situations where they had to exercise personal judgment about their obligations. This wasn't quite rebellion, but it was a subtle shift toward greater autonomy within the constraints of bondage. The economic consequences were significant but complex. The crisis disrupted temple operations for months, reducing productivity and profits just when Egypt needed maximum economic efficiency for military campaigns. However, the resolution also clarified property rights and administrative procedures in ways that made future economic planning more predictable. International observers, particularly Egypt's enemies and trading partners, paid careful attention to the crisis as evidence of internal Egyptian weaknesses. The spectacle of a pharaoh having to negotiate with his own religious institutions for access to resources suggested that Egypt's centralized authority was less absolute than it appeared, information that would prove valuable in future military and diplomatic encounters. The long-term impact included the development of more sophisticated legal frameworks for managing institutional conflicts and property rights. The precedents established during the crisis influenced Egyptian law for centuries, creating procedures for resolving disputes between competing authorities and clarifying the limits of both royal and religious power. Unintended consequences included the emergence of temple slaves as a distinct political class with their own interests and perspectives. The crisis had forced them to think about their loyalties and obligations in new ways, creating forms of consciousness that hadn't existed when they were simply following daily routines without questioning larger institutional arrangements. This crisis wasn't just about administrative disputes or resource allocation. It was about the fundamental question of whether a civilization could successfully institutionalize competing forms of absolute authority. Egypt had created a system where both pharaohs and gods claimed ultimate power, enforced through institutions that both depended on human bondage but served different masters. The temple inventory crisis revealed that this arrangement worked fine during periods of abundance and stability, but became impossible to maintain during times of scarcity and conflict, when resources were limited and hard choices had to be made. The comfortable fiction that earthly and divine authority naturally aligned completely broke down. What the crisis revealed about Egyptian society was deeply uncomfortable. The entire system depended on people accepting contradictory loyalties and impossible obligations without questioning the fundamental logic of the arrangement. Temple slaves were expected to serve both gods and kings without ever considering that these authorities might have conflicting interests or competing claims on their labor. The psychological impact on people caught in these contradictions was significant, but rarely documented. We can only imagine the stress of being legally required to obey earthly masters while spiritually obligated to serve divine ones, particularly when those obligations conflicted in ways that made any choice potentially catastrophic. Modern parallels include various situations where people are caught between competing institutional loyalties, employees whose companies make demands that conflict with their professional ethics, citizens whose governments require actions that violate their religious beliefs, or workers whose economic survival depends on institutions whose values they reject. The long-term historical significance was the demonstration that even the most sophisticated and stable systems of organized oppression contained internal contradictions that could create crisis without warning. The Egyptians had created what appeared to be a perfectly balanced system of religious, economic, and political authority, but the balance depended on circumstances that weren't guaranteed to continue indefinitely. Why historians still debate this crisis is that it represents a turning point where ancient Egyptian civilization confronted the limits of what institutional authority could accomplish through human bondage, but somehow managed to adapt and continue rather than collapse completely. Around the dramatic institutional conflicts and economic power struggles, a fascinating cast of secondary characters played crucial roles that revealed the human complexity of temple slavery. These weren't just background figures. They were people whose individual stories illuminate different aspects of a system that managed to be simultaneously oppressive and oddly liberating. Meet Bakin Khonsu, a temple slave who became the ancient world's equivalent of a middle manager with an existential crisis. Bakin Khonsu worked as an overseer of other temple slaves in the workshops of Karnak, which meant he was simultaneously oppressed and oppressor, property and property manager. His job involved enforcing work schedules, maintaining quality standards, and disciplining workers who were legally his equals, but practically his subordinates. The psychological complexity of Bacon Consu's position was captured in a remarkable letter he wrote to a friend, preserved by accident in a collection of administrative documents. He complained about the difficulty of motivating workers who couldn't be fired, couldn't quit, and couldn't be promoted to positions that offered genuine independence. How, he wrote, does one inspire excellence in people who have no hope of freedom and no fear of unemployment? It was ancient Egypt's version of modern corporate management challenges, except with added divine oversight and lifetime employment contracts. Bacon Consu also struggled with the moral contradictions of his position. He had been born into temple slavery and worked his way up through intelligence, competence, and political skill. His success within the system made him both a beneficiary of oppression and a victim of it. He lived better than most free Egyptians, but couldn't leave his job, couldn't start his own business, and couldn't pass his accumulated wealth to his children as inheritance rather than temple property. Khaemwaset represented a completely different aspect of temple slavery. She was a sacred musician whose artistic talents made her simultaneously valuable and trapped. Temple music wasn't casual entertainment. It was considered essential to proper religious ritual, and skilled musicians like Khaemwaset were literally irreplaceable components of cosmic maintenance operations. Her daily routine involved composing and performing complex musical pieces that accompanied religious ceremonies, training younger musicians, maintaining expensive instruments, and traveling between temples for special festivals and celebrations. She was treated more like a valued artist than a piece of property, receiving special housing, fine food, expensive clothing, and considerable respect from temple officials and worshippers. Yet Khaemwaset's artistic success made her bondage more complete, not less. The better she became at her craft, the more essential she became to temple operations, and the more impossible it became for her to imagine any alternative way of life. Her talent had become her prison, and her artistic fulfillment was inseparable from her personal oppression. She was living the ancient equivalent of a recording contract that never expired. Her letters, yes, temple slaves could write letters, and some survived, reveal someone who found genuine meaning and satisfaction in her work, while being painfully aware that her creativity served purposes she hadn't chosen and benefited people who owned her. She wrote music that moved people to religious ecstasy, while being unable to control how her talents were used, or who profited from her artistic labor. Khaemwaset showed yet another face of temple slavery. He was a troublemaker whose constant minor rebellions illustrated both the limits of temple authority and the creative ways people found to resist systemic oppression. Khaemwaset worked in the temple breweries, which gave him access to alcohol and opportunities for creative mischief that would have made modern workplace comedies jealous. His disciplinary record, preserved in temple administrative files, reads like a catalogue of passive-aggressive workplace rebellion. He accidentally over-fermented beer, so it became too strong for religious ceremonies. He misunderstood instructions and produced flavored beers when only plain beer was requested. He developed mysterious illnesses that coincided with important religious festivals when extra work was required. Khaemwaset's resistance wasn't political or organized. It was personal and petty. The kind of small-scale rebellion that people used to maintain psychological autonomy within oppressive systems. He couldn't quit his job or change his legal status, but he could make his supervisors' lives slightly more difficult and complicated. It was resistance through incompetence, rebellion, through bureaucratic malicious compliance. The temple's response to Paneb was equally revealing. Rather than severely punishing his obvious insubordination, administrators tried various forms of positive reinforcement, additional training, and work reassignment. They understood that replacing skilled workers was difficult and expensive, so they tolerated considerable misbehavior rather than lose productive capacity through harsh discipline. These weren't isolated incidents. The lives of Bakin Khonsu, Tanageret, Paneb, and thousands of other temple slaves were interconnected through complex webs of relationships, dependencies, and shared experiences that created informal communities within the formal structure of institutional bondage. Bakin Khonsu's management responsibilities put him in regular contact with artists like Tanageret and troublemakers like Paneb, creating workplace relationships that transcended the official hierarchy. He had to find ways to motivate Tanegeret's continued artistic excellence while managing Paneb's disruptive behavior, balancing the needs of temple operations against the human realities of managing enslaved workers. The informal networks that developed among temple slaves created support systems that helped people cope with the psychological stress of permanent bondage. Tanageret used her music to provide emotional outlet for other slaves, composing informal songs that expressed feelings and experiences that couldn't be officially acknowledged. Paneb's minor rebellions provided vicarious satisfaction for other slaves who couldn't risk their own acts of resistance. These relationships also created informal economies within the temple system. Skilled slaves like Bakin Khonsu could offer favors, better work assignments, or protection from punishment in exchange for cooperation, information, or personal services. Tanegeret's musical talents made her popular at private gatherings where slaves could socialize outside official temple functions. Even Paneb's brewing skills were valuable for unofficial celebrations and social bonding. The temple's political networks extended far beyond individual institutions. Slaves were regularly transferred between temples, creating connections that spread across Egypt's entire religious establishment. A carpenter trained at one temple might be sent to work on construction projects at another temple, bringing skills, information, and personal relationships that link different institutions together. These networks sometimes conflicted with official temple hierarchies and state policies. Information about working conditions, management practices, and opportunities for advancement spread through informal slave communities faster than through official channels. Slaves developed their own systems for evaluating temples as employers, sharing knowledge about which institutions offered better treatment, more opportunities, or more tolerable working conditions. The unintended consequences included the creation of a distinct subculture with its own values, traditions, and forms of solidarity that existed parallel to official Egyptian society. Temple slaves developed their own forms of entertainment, their own informal justice systems for resolving disputes, and their own methods for supporting members who faced personal crises or official punishment. Political implications were significant, but rarely acknowledged by temple or state authorities. The informal networks among temple slaves created communication systems that could spread information, coordinate resistance, or organize collective action more effectively than official, administrative channels. While large-scale slave rebellions were rare, the potential for coordinated resistance was always present. Marriage and family relationships among temple slaves created additional complexities. Children born to temple slaves automatically became temple property, but parents still tried to position their children for better opportunities within the system. Informal mentorship works helped talented young slaves develop skills that might lead to better positions, while family connections provided emotional support and practical assistance. The most fascinating aspect was how these relationships created forms of social mobility within a system designed to prevent individual advancement. Talented slaves could build reputations and influence that transcended their official status, earning respect and informal authority that made their opinions valuable to temple administrators who technically owned them. Economic relationships also developed independently of official temple policies. Slaves with valuable skills could earn money through freelance work during their limited free time, creating personal wealth that couldn't be officially acknowledged, but was practically important. These informal economies created incentives for cooperation and productivity that supplemented the formal systems of rewards and punishments. To understand how temple slavery functioned as a social system, you have to understand the broader cultural context that made permanent human bondage seem normal and even beneficial to most ancient Egyptians, including many slaves themselves. This wasn't a society that had developed concepts of individual rights, personal autonomy, or economic freedom as fundamental human values. Daily life in ancient Egypt was structured around hierarchical relationships, inherited obligations, and acceptance of circumstances determined by birth, divine will, or social necessity. Free farmers were tied to land they didn't own. Artisans worked for masters who controlled their access to materials and markets, and even wealthy merchants operated within systems of patronage and obligation that limited their independence. Religious beliefs reinforced these social structures by emphasizing divine order, cosmic hierarchy, and the spiritual importance of accepting one's assigned role in the universal system. The concept of Mat didn't just govern cosmic balance. It provided theological justification for social arrangements that kept everyone in their proper place according to divine plan. For most Egyptians, the idea that people should be free to choose their occupations, change their social status, or pursue individual happiness independent of social obligations would have seemed not just impractical, but actively dangerous to cosmic order. Temple slavery wasn't an aberration from Egyptian values. It was a logical extension of beliefs about divine authority, social hierarchy, and personal obligation that pervaded the entire culture. What was considered normal versus exceptional reveals how different ancient Egyptian society was from modern assumptions about human nature and social organization. Individual ambition was acceptable only within established social frameworks. Personal relationships were understood primarily in terms of mutual obligations rather than emotional bonds. Economic activity was embedded in religious and political structures that made independent entrepreneurship difficult and often impossible. Social structures that modern people would find oppressive were experienced by most ancient Egyptians as natural and beneficial. The temple system provided security, meaning, and community for people who might otherwise face hunger, homelessness, or social isolation. Even slaves often had better living conditions and more stable social relationships than free people who lacked family connections or economic resources. The cultural values that shaped temple slavery included concepts of reciprocal obligation between superiors and inferiors, divine oversight of human relationships, and collective responsibility for maintaining social order. These weren't abstract philosophical principles, they were practical guidelines that governed daily interactions and personal decisions. Understanding this cultural context doesn't excuse or justify human bondage, but it helps explain how systems of organized oppression can persist for centuries when they're embedded in broader cultural frameworks that make them seem natural, necessary, and even beneficial to the people involved. Modern parallels might include various forms of institutional loyalty, professional obligation, and social expectation that limit individual freedom while providing security and meaning within established systems. Perhaps most remarkable was how temple slavery created situations where the most oppressed people were sometimes the most privileged, the most controlled was sometimes the most influential, and the most valuable human resources were the least free to control their own lives. Temple slaves often lived better than free Egyptian farmers, ate better food than independent artisans, and had more job security than merchants or craftsmen who own their own businesses. They received medical care when sick, support when disabled, and care in old age that wasn't available to free people who lacked family resources or social connections. The educational opportunities available to temple slaves were often superior to what free children could access. Temples invested in training their human resources, providing literacy, numeracy, technical skills, and specialized knowledge that made slaves more valuable as workers and more capable as individuals. Many temple slaves were better educated than free citizens, creating the absurd situation where bondage came with better access to learning and intellectual development than freedom. Career advancement within temple hierarchies could lead to positions with more real authority and influence than most free Egyptians ever achieved. Senior temple slaves made decisions that affected hundreds of people, managed substantial resources, and exercised practical power that transcended their legal status as property. They were simultaneously powerless and powerful, owned and owning authority over others. The ultimate irony was that the most successful temple slaves were often the most thoroughly trapped. Their skills and knowledge made them indispensable to temple operations, which made their freedom impossible to imagine or achieve. Success within the system made escape from the system more difficult, not easier. Modern parallels to these contradictions include various situations where institutional membership provides benefits and opportunities that aren't available to independent individuals, but at the cost of autonomy and freedom to make fundamental choices about life direction and personal values. Corporate employment, military service, academic careers, and professional licensing systems all create similar tensions between institutional benefits and personal independence. Everything changed when Akhenaten decided that Egypt had too many gods and not enough centralized authority, a revolutionary idea that was either brilliant religious reform or of the ancient world's most expensive midlife crisis, depending on your perspective. Around 1353 BCE, this pharaoh looked at Egypt's complex religious system with its hundreds of temples, thousands of slaves, and massive economic networks, and essentially said, "What if we simplified this whole operation?" Akhenaten's religious revolution wasn't just about theology. It was about breaking the economic and political power of the temple establishment that had grown so influential it could challenge royal authority. The temple inventory crisis under Ramesses III had demonstrated the problems, but Akhenaten proposed a solution that was characteristically Egyptian in its ambition and characteristically human in its unintended consequences. The Ottoman Revolution represented a fundamental shift from a distributed religious economy, managed by multiple competing institutions, to a centralized system controlled directly by the pharaoh. Instead of dozens of major temples with their own slaves, economic operations, and political influence, Akhenaten envisioned a single religious authority that would streamline divine service, while eliminating institutional competition for resources and loyalty. This wasn't just religious reform. It was the ancient world's first attempt at corporate restructuring on a civilizational scale. Akhenaten was essentially proposing to merge all of Egypt's religious institutions into a single entity with himself as CEO, divine authority as the business model, and a dramatically simplified organizational chart that eliminated middle management in favor of direct divine royal authority. The background to this transformation included growing tensions between royal authority and temple power that had been building for decades. The temple's economic success had made them semi-independent political entities that could resist state demands, influence policy decisions, and pursue their own interests in ways that sometimes conflicted with royal plans. Something had to give, and Akhenaten decided it should be the entire traditional religious system. Why this moment was different from previous pharaonic attempts to control temple power was the comprehensiveness of Akhenaten's vision. Earlier rulers had tried to manage, regulate, or co-opt temple authority while leaving the basic system intact. Akhenaten proposed to eliminate the system entirely and replace it with something unprecedented, monotheistic royal authority that would make religious, economic, and political power completely indistinguishable. Key factors that led to this transformation included the influence of foreign religious ideas, the practical problems of managing competing institutional authorities, and probably Akhenaten's personal conviction that he had discovered a better way to organize divine-human relationships. Whether his motives were primarily religious, political, or economic remains debated, but the practical effect was an attempt to revolutionize the entire system that had made temple slavery both economically profitable and spiritually meaningful. The immediate trigger was Akhenaten's declaration that all gods except Atum were false, all temples except those dedicated to Atum were illegitimate, and all religious authority except what flowed directly from the pharaoh was invalid. This wasn't reformation. It was revolution disguised as religious revelation. The transformation unfolded like a slow-motion corporate takeover conducted by people who believed they were implementing divine will. Akhenaten didn't just announce his new religious policy and expect everyone to comply. He had to systematically dismantle institutions that had operated for centuries, while creating new ones that had never been tested at scale. The process began with what modern management consultants would recognize as a comprehensive audit of temple operations, except the auditors believed they were identifying spiritual corruption rather than operational inefficiencies. Royal officials were sent to every major temple with instructions to inventory not just material resources, but religious practices, administrative procedures, and personnel qualifications according to new criteria that basically declared most traditional Egyptian religion to be fraudulent. Temple slaves found themselves caught in an institutional reorganization that was simultaneously liberation and catastrophe. The traditional temples that had owned them were being disbanded, which should have meant freedom, but they were being transferred to new Aten temples that operated according to different principles, but still required human labor that couldn't quit, negotiate, or leave. The resistance to change was immediate and sophisticated. Traditional priests didn't just oppose Akhenaten's reforms on religious grounds. They organized economic and political resistance that leveraged their institutional resources and social networks. Temples began hiding assets, transferring slaves to friendly institutions, and creating legal complications that made royal takeovers difficult and expensive. Some temple slaves actively participated in this resistance, helping to conceal temple resources, or maintain traditional religious practices in secret. Others saw the reforms as opportunities to improve their circumstances by cooperating with the new system and gaining favorable positions in Ottoman temples. The result was a complex pattern of collaboration and resistance that split temple slave communities along lines of personal opportunity, religious conviction, and institutional loyalty. Champions of change included not just Akhenaten and his immediate supporters, but also people who had been disadvantaged by the traditional temple system and saw revolution as an opportunity for advancement. Some slaves used the disruption to escape their legal obligations entirely, disappearing during the chaos of institutional reorganization and establishing new lives as free people in distant parts of Egypt. The specific steps of transformation involved closing traditional temples, redistributing their resources, reassigning their personnel, and establishing new autumn worship centers that were supposed to operate more efficiently and with clearer lines of authority. In practice, this meant destroying institutions that had developed sophisticated operational procedures over centuries and replacing them with experimental organizations that had to learn everything from scratch. Obstacles encountered included massive logistical challenges, widespread passive resistance, active sabotage by displaced temple personnel, and the simple practical difficulty of managing thousands of people whose jobs, homes, and identities were tied to institutions that were being eliminated. Moving temple slaves from one institutional context to another turned out to be much more complicated than moving inventory or reassigning administrative responsibilities. Breakthrough moments included successful transitions at some temples where new autumn worship procedures proved effective and popular, creating models that could be replicated elsewhere. Some temple slaves adapted enthusiastically to simplified religious duties and streamlined administrative procedures, demonstrating that institutional change was possible even within systems of human bondage. The role of individuals versus larger historical forces created fascinating contradictions. Akhenaten's personal vision drove the entire transformation, but its success or failure depended on the cooperation of thousands of people whose individual decisions about compliance, resistance, or adaptation ultimately determined whether the revolution would succeed. Temple administrators faced impossible choices between loyalty to traditional religious values and adaptation to new political realities. Skilled slaves found themselves with unexpected leverage of both old and new institutions competed for their cooperation and expertise. Religious conservatives had to decide whether to risk punishment for maintaining traditional practices or accept spiritual compromise for practical survival. Economic disruption was enormous but uneven. Some temple operations continued with minimal interruption under new management and religious justification. Others collapsed entirely when their traditional religious purposes were declared illegitimate and their operational procedures were abandoned. The overall effect was economic chaos that took years to resolve, but also opportunities for innovation and reorganization that wouldn't have been possible within the stable traditional system. International observers watched Akhenaten's reforms with fascination and horror, recognizing both the potential benefits of more centralized authority and the risks of destroying institutional systems that had proven effective over long periods. Egypt's enemies hoped the reforms would weaken Egyptian power. Egypt's allies, worried about the stability of their diplomatic and economic relationships. The most remarkable aspect was how quickly centuries-old institutions could be dismantled when royal authority was applied systematically and comprehensively. Traditional temples that had seemed permanent and unchangeable proved surprisingly fragile when their legal protections, economic resources, and social support were withdrawn simultaneously. The new system that emerged from Akhenaten's revolution was simultaneously simpler and more complex than what it replaced. On the surface, religious life had been streamlined: one god, one style of worship, one source of religious authority. In practice, the changes created new forms of complexity that nobody had anticipated, and few people were prepared to manage. Temple slavery under the Ottoman system operated according to different principles that were theoretically more rational and efficient, instead of complex hierarchies serving multiple gods with different requirements. Slaves were organized into standardized work units with clearly defined responsibilities and uniform procedures. It was ancient Egypt's version of industrial organization applied to religious labor. The new temples were designed for efficiency rather than traditional religious symbolism. Ottoman worship emphasized natural light and open spaces, which meant architectural changes that affected how work was organized and how daily routines were structured. Temple slaves found themselves working in environments that were physically different from traditional temples, with implications for everything from storage procedures to ceremonial protocols. How things were different became apparent in daily routines that were simultaneously simpler and more demanding. Ottoman worship required fewer ceremonial objects and complex rituals, but it demanded more intensive focus on solar cycles and personal devotion that made every aspect of temple life subject to direct divine observation. Slaves couldn't hide in the complexity of traditional religious procedures. Their work and attitudes were exposed to constant scrutiny under the new system's emphasis on spiritual transparency. Who won and who lost created new social hierarchies within the temple slave population. People with skills relevant to Ottoman worship, solar calendar calculation, architectural construction, administrative organization, found themselves promoted to positions of greater responsibility and better living conditions. Those whose expertise was tied to traditional religious practices faced demotion, displacement, or unemployment. New rules and norms included standardized work schedules based on solar cycles rather than complex religious calendars, simplified dietary requirements that reduced the burden of food preparation, and streamlined administrative procedures that eliminated many traditional bureaucratic positions. The changes were designed to make temple operations more efficient, but they also eliminated jobs and career paths that had provided advancement opportunities for ambitious slaves. What stayed the same versus what changed dramatically revealed the limits of institutional revolution. The fundamental legal relationship between temples and slaves remained unchanged. People were still owned by religious institutions and couldn't leave, quit, or negotiate their working conditions. The revolution had changed the religious and administrative context of their bondage without altering its basic character. Living conditions for most temple slaves improved in some ways, while deteriorating in others. Simplified religious requirements reduced some work burdens, but the new system's emphasis on efficiency eliminated many traditional protections and privileges that slaves had enjoyed under the more complex traditional arrangements. The psychological impact was enormous and varied. Some slaves found the simplified religious system more meaningful and easier to understand than traditional Egyptian religion, with its hundreds of gods and complex mythological relationships. Others experienced the changes as spiritual impoverishment that stripped away cultural traditions and personal meaning without providing adequate replacements. Economic productivity under the new system was initially lower than under traditional arrangements, as people had to learn new procedures and adapt to different organizational structures. However, the simplified operations eventually became more efficient in some areas, particularly administrative tasks and resource management, that benefited from standardization and centralized control. Social relationships among temple slaves changed as traditional networks based on shared service to specific gods were replaced by work units organized around functional tasks rather than religious devotion. This created new forms of solidarity and conflict as people adapted to different ways of organizing their professional and personal relationships. Was this change an improvement over the traditional temple slavery system? The answer depends entirely on whose perspective you take and what criteria you use for evaluation, which tells us something important about how difficult it is to assess reforms within fundamentally oppressive systems. From Akhenaten's perspective, the reforms were obviously successful. They centralized religious authority, simplified administrative procedures, and eliminated institutional competition for royal power. The new system was more efficient, more controllable, and more aligned with his vision of proper divine-human relationships. Future pharaohs would remember his innovations as a useful model for managing religious institutions, even if they rejected his specific theological innovations. Different perspectives emerged among the people actually affected by the changes. Some temple slaves genuinely appreciated the simplified religious duties, standardized procedures, and reduced ceremonial burdens that came with autumn worship. Others mourned the loss of traditional religious practices, career advancement opportunities, and cultural traditions that had made their bondage more psychologically tolerable. Short-term versus long-term effects created different evaluations of the reform's success. In the immediate aftermath, disruption and confusion dominated most people's experience of institutional change. Economic productivity declined, social relationships were stressed, and many traditional support systems were destroyed without adequate replacements being established. Long-term effects proved more positive for some aspects of temple organization and more negative for others. The administrative innovations introduced during Akhenaten's reign influenced temple management for centuries. Even after traditional Egyptian religion was restored, future temple administrators adopted many of the organizational techniques and efficiency measures that had been developed for autumn worship, creating hybrid systems that combine traditional religious practices with reformed administrative procedures. Unintended consequences included the development of underground networks among temple slaves who maintained traditional religious practices in secret during the autumn period. These networks created forms of solidarity and resistance that persisted after the traditional religion was restored, contributing to later challenges to both temple and royal authority. The most significant unintended consequence was that the revolution demonstrated how quickly and completely established institutions could be transformed when sufficient authority was applied systematically. This lesson wasn't lost on later rulers who faced similar challenges with powerful religious or economic institutions. Sometimes the solution wasn't negotiation or compromise, but comprehensive institutional transformation. Modern judgment versus contemporary views reveals interesting contradictions. Contemporary Egyptians who supported the reforms saw them as spiritual purification and administrative rationalization. Those who opposed them viewed the changes as sacrilege and cultural destruction. Modern historians tend to evaluate the reforms in terms of their effectiveness in achieving political and economic goals, often ignoring their spiritual significance. To the people who experience them, the evaluation ultimately depends on Whether you believe institutional efficiency and centralized authority more important than cultural tradition and institutional diversity, Akhenaten's reforms were successful as exercises in royal power and administrative rationalization. But they were also cultural disasters that destroyed traditional practices and social relationships that had provided meaning and stability for thousands of people whose opinions about the changes were never seriously considered. In the decades that followed Akhenaten's failed revolution, Egypt experienced what historians politely call religious restoration, but what was actually the ancient world's most comprehensive example of institutional whiplash. When Tutankhamun and his successors abandoned Atum worship and restored traditional Egyptian religion, they faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding temple systems that had been systematically dismantled, while managing thousands of displaced temple slaves whose lives had been disrupted by a decade of revolutionary experimentation. The restoration wasn't just a matter of reopening closed temples and resuming traditional rituals. It required rebuilding institutional knowledge, re-establishing economic networks, and recreating social relationships that had been destroyed. During the Ottoman period, many of the priests, administrators, and skilled craftsmen who had maintained traditional religious practices were dead, exiled, or had adapted to different careers. The temples had to essentially restart their operations with a workforce that included people who remembered the old ways, people who had only known the Ottoman system, and people who had spent the revolutionary period trying to avoid religious service entirely. Temple slaves found themselves caught in yet another institutional transformation that nobody had consulted them about. Those who had adapted successfully to Ottoman worship were suddenly working in systems that operated according to principles they didn't fully understand, serving gods they hadn't been trained to serve, and following procedures that seemed unnecessarily complex compared to the streamlined Ottoman rituals they had learned. New challenges emerged from the intersection of institutional restoration and generational change. Young temple slaves who had grown up during the Ottoman period had to learn traditional Egyptian religious practices that were completely foreign to their experience, while older slaves who remembered pre-Akhenaten procedures struggled to adapt to innovations that had been introduced during the restoration process. Evolution of the situation included the development of hybrid religious and administrative practices that combined elements from traditional Egyptian religion, innovations from the Ottoman period, and new ideas that emerged during the restoration process. The temples that were rebuilt weren't exact recreations of their pre-Akhenaten predecessors. They were new institutions that incorporated lessons learned from a decade of religious experimentation. Second-generation effects included changes in how temple slaves thought about their relationships to religious institutions and royal authority. The Akhenaten period had demonstrated that established religious practices weren't permanent or unchangeable, that royal authority could transform institutional arrangements completely, and that individual adaptation and survival sometimes required flexibility about fundamental beliefs and loyalties. The most significant long-term change was the development of more sophisticated understanding among temple slaves about the political and economic dimensions of religious institutions. The revolution and restoration had made it impossible to maintain the comfortable fiction that temple service was purely spiritual other than economic and political work disguised as religious devotion. The restoration period brought forward a new generation of temple administrators, royal officials, and religious leaders who had learned important lessons from the Akhenaten crisis about the dangers of allowing religious institutions to become too powerful or independent. These new players approached temple management with different priorities and more sophisticated strategies for balancing religious, economic, and political considerations. Horemheb, who eventually became pharaoh, represents the new type of leader who emerged from the institutional chaos of the Ottoman period. He wasn't a traditional religious figure or a royal heir with inherited authority. He was essentially a professional manager who had learned how to run complex institutions effectively. While maintaining centralized control, his approach to temple administration emphasized accountability, efficiency, and clear lines of authority that would prevent future religious institutions from challenging royal power. Horemheb's innovations in temple management included the systematic appointment of royal officials to oversee temple operations, regular audits of temple resources and activities, and legal frameworks that clarified the relationship between religious authority and state power. These weren't theological reforms. They were administrative changes designed to ensure that temples would never again accumulate enough independent power to challenge royal authority. Maya, who served as treasurer under Tutankhamun and later pharaohs, developed new approaches to managing temple finances that emphasized integration with royal economic planning rather than independent temple fiscal policy. Maya understood that the temple's economic power had been the foundation of their political independence, so he created systems that made temple economic success dependent on cooperation with state economic policies. His financial innovations included centralized accounting procedures that made temple resources visible to royal administrators, coordinated investment strategies that aligned temple economic interests with state priorities, and personnel policies that ensured temple financial managers maintained loyalty to royal rather than purely religious authority. Among temple slaves themselves, new types of leaders emerged who had learned to navigate the complexities of institutional change and uncertainty. These weren't traditional religious figures or inherited administrative positions. They were people who had developed skills in adaptation, negotiation, and survival that made them valuable to both temple and royal authorities during periods of institutional transformation. Amenemheb, a temple slave who had survived both the Ottoman Revolution and the Restoration, became a model for how people in bondage could maintain personal agency and influence within systems designed to eliminate individual autonomy. His career involved serving in traditional temples, adapting to Ottoman worship, helping with restoration efforts, and eventually becoming an advisor to temple administrators about how to manage institutional change without losing essential personnel. These new leaders differed from earlier players in their understanding of institutional flexibility and change. Previous generations of temple administrators had operated within stable religious and political frameworks that seemed permanent and unchangeable. The new generation understood that institutional arrangements were contingent and adaptable, which made them both more effective managers and more sophisticated political operators. Their contributions included the development of management techniques that could maintain operational continuity during periods of institutional change, communication strategies that could build consensus among diverse stakeholders with competing interests, and organizational structures that could adapt to changing political and economic circumstances without losing their essential functions. The disruptions they caused weren't intentional revolutionary activities, but rather the natural consequences of applying more sophisticated and flexible approaches to institutional management. Their innovations made temple operations more efficient and politically sustainable, but they also changed the fundamental character of temple slavery by making it more obviously connected to political and economic considerations rather than purely religious devotion. But some problems persisted despite institutional reforms, administrative innovations, and lessons learned from the Ottoman crisis. The fundamental contradiction between human dignity and institutional bondage couldn't be resolved through better management techniques or more sophisticated organizational structures. It could only be temporarily managed or strategically ignored. Continuing challenges included the problem of motivation and loyalty among people who had no choice about their employment, no control over their working conditions, and no prospects for genuine independence, regardless of their performance or achievements. The Akhenaten period had demonstrated that even the most established religious and social arrangements could change completely without warning, which made it difficult for temple slaves to invest emotionally in institutional loyalty when institutions themselves proved to be unstable and unreliable. The generational transmission of temple slavery remained problematic despite various reform efforts. Children born into temple slavery continued to inherit their parents' legal status regardless of their personal talents, interests, or preferences. This created ongoing tensions between individual potential and institutional requirements that couldn't be resolved within the existing legal and social framework. New versions of old problems emerged as temple administrators tried to apply lessons learned from previous institutional crises. Attempts to prevent temples from accumulating excessive independent power sometimes created new forms of inefficiency and dysfunction. Efforts to maintain royal control over temple operations sometimes interfered with religious practices in ways that undermined the spiritual legitimacy that justified the entire system. Economic integration between temple and state operations, designed to prevent institutional conflicts like those that had precipitated the Ottoman crisis, created new forms of corruption and mismanagement. When temple resources were closely integrated with royal economic planning, it became easier for individuals to exploit both systems for personal benefit while avoiding accountability to either religious or political authority. Cyclical patterns became apparent as new generations of temple administrators, royal officials, and enslaved workers repeated many of the same mistakes and conflicts that had created problems in previous periods. Institutional memory proved insufficient to prevent the recurrence of predictable problems, particularly when solving those problems required acknowledging fundamental contradictions in the system's basic assumptions about human nature and social organization. The most intractable issue was the question of what temple slavery was actually supposed to accomplish beyond providing labor for religious and economic operations. The spiritual justifications that had originally legitimized human bondage, divine service became increasingly difficult to maintain as the political and economic dimensions of temple operations became more obvious and dominant. Why certain issues proved intractable despite repeated reform efforts was that they reflected fundamental contradictions in Egyptian society's attempt to combine sophisticated economic and political institutions with religious worldviews that required believing in cosmic order, divine justice, and spiritual meaning. Temple slavery worked as an economic system and as a political arrangement, but it created psychological and moral problems that couldn't be solved through administrative innovation or institutional reform. The persistence of these problems contributed to long-term social and political instability that manifested in different ways during different periods, but represented ongoing tensions between Egyptian civilization's practical achievements and its spiritual aspirations. The society that created some of humanity's most impressive architectural and artistic accomplishments did so partly through systematically exploiting human potential while denying human dignity, creating internal contradictions that influenced Egyptian development for centuries. Modern parallels include various contemporary examples of institutional arrangements that provide material benefits and social stability while creating psychological costs and moral problems that can't be resolved within existing organizational frameworks, compared to other civilizations' approaches to organizing labor, managing religious institutions, and balancing political authority with economic power. Egyptian temple slavery represented both an impressive achievement in institutional sophistication and a cautionary example of the costs of systematic human exploitation. Mesopotamian temple systems, while also using various forms of bonded labor, never developed the comprehensive integration of religious authority, economic power, and human bondage that characterized Egyptian institutions. Mesopotamian temples competed with secular authorities for resources and influence, but they didn't achieve the level of autonomous institutional power that made Egyptian temples potentially rival governments. Greek and Roman slavery operated according to different principles that emphasized individual ownership of human property rather than institutional bondage to religious corporations. This created different forms of exploitation and different possibilities for manumission and social mobility. But it also meant that enslaved people in classical civilizations faced different psychological and social challenges than Egyptian temple slaves. What was unique about the Egyptian system was its combination of sophisticated institutional management, comprehensive ideological justification, and long-term stability that made temple slavery an integral part of civilization's basic structure, rather than a marginal practice that could be eliminated without fundamentally changing social and economic organization. The Egyptian approach to managing the contradictions between religious idealism and economic exploitation was more comprehensive and intellectually sophisticated than comparable systems in other civilizations. Egyptian temple slavery wasn't just an economic arrangement justified by religious authority. It was a complete worldview that made human bondage seem spiritually meaningful and cosmically necessary. What was universal about Egyptian temple slavery were the basic human responses to systematic exploitation, the institutional dynamics that emerge when organizations acquire comprehensive power over human lives, and the psychological strategies people develop to maintain dignity and agency within oppressive systems. These patterns repeated in different forms throughout history and across different cultures. Lessons that could be learned from Egyptian temple slavery include understanding how sophisticated institutions can systematize human exploitation while maintaining ideological legitimacy, how economic and religious authority can be combined to create particularly comprehensive forms of social control, and how people can maintain resilience and adapt to changing circumstances even within oppressive systems. The most important lesson might be recognizing how easily systems of human exploitation can be made to seem natural, beneficial, and even morally necessary when they're embedded in comprehensive ideological frameworks that provide meaning and justification for practices that would otherwise be obviously wrong. Patterns that repeated elsewhere include the use of religious authority to justify economic exploitation, the development of hierarchical systems that provide limited opportunities for advancement within oppressive structures, and the creation of institutional arrangements that make systematic exploitation seem personally beneficial to some of the people being exploited. The Egyptian model influenced later civilizations' approaches to organizing religious institutions, managing large-scale economic enterprises, and combining spiritual authority with temporal power in ways that are still visible in contemporary institutional arrangements, dated by the late period roughly 664 to 330 to BCE. Signs pointed to fundamental changes in how Egyptian society organized religious institutions, managed human labor, and justified systems of bondage that had seemed permanent and unchangeable for over 1,000 years. The warning signs weren't dramatic rebellions or sudden political revelations. They were subtle shifts in economic conditions, cultural attitudes, and practical circumstances that gradually made traditional temple slavery less profitable, less justifiable, and less sustainable. What key players could see was that Egypt's position in an increasingly interconnected ancient world was changing in ways that affected the viability of institutions designed for earlier historical circumstances. International trade required more flexible labor arrangements. Diplomatic relationships demanded conformity with foreign legal standards, and military pressures necessitated economic efficiency that traditional temple slavery couldn't provide. Progressive temple administrators recognized that their institutions needed to adapt to changing circumstances or risk becoming irrelevant to Egypt's economic and political needs. Some began experimenting with modified labor arrangements that provided greater incentives for skilled workers while maintaining institutional control over essential operations. What they missed was how quickly external pressures could overwhelm institutional arrangements that had seemed stable and well established. The traditional temple system had developed during periods when Egypt was either isolated from foreign influence or powerful enough to impose its own standards on international relationships. As Egypt's relative power declined and foreign influence increased, institutions designed for cultural isolation became liabilities rather than assets. Foreign influences included exposure to Greek concepts of individual freedom, Persian administrative practices that emphasized meritocratic advancement, and trade relationships with civilizations that organized labor according to different principles. These influences didn't immediately undermine Egyptian temple slavery, but they provided alternative models that made traditional arrangements seem less natural and inevitable. Economic pressures included competition from foreign producers who had access to free wage labor, changing trade patterns that required more flexible and responsive business operations, and fiscal crises that made the economic inefficiencies of traditional temple slavery more apparent and problematic for Egypt's overall economic performance. Resistance to inevitable change came primarily from temple hierarchies that had built their power and wealth on traditional arrangements, conservative religious leaders who viewed institutional changes as theological threats, and royal officials who feared that modifying temple slavery weakened other forms of royal authority and social control. The most telling sign was the gradual shift in how educated Egyptians discussed and justified traditional labor arrangements. Earlier periods had seen confident assertions about the spiritual necessity and cosmic importance of temple slavery. Later periods showed increasing defensive argumentation, elaborate theological explanations for practices that had previously seemed self-evidently justified, and growing acknowledgement that alternative arrangements might be practically necessary, even if they were spiritually inferior. Cultural changes included the emergence of Egyptian intellectuals who had been educated in foreign institutions or exposed to foreign ideas, creating a class of people who understood Egyptian traditions from comparative perspectives that made those traditions seem contingent rather than universal. The end of Egyptian temple slavery wasn't a single dramatic event, but rather a process of institutional transformation that occurred over several centuries, as Egypt was incorporated into larger political and economic systems that operated according to different principles. The Persian conquest in 525 BCE, Alexander's conquest in 330 BCE, and the subsequent Ptolemaic and Roman periods created successive waves of change that gradually transformed temple slavery from a central institution to an anachronistic survival. Persian rule under Cambyses and his successors introduced administrative practices that emphasized efficiency and standardization over traditional religious arrangements. Persian officials weren't necessarily opposed to temple slavery on moral grounds, but they were interested in maximizing tax revenue and ensuring reliable labor for state projects, which sometimes conflicted with traditional temple prerogatives and labor arrangements. The Persians implemented administrative reforms that subjected temple operations to closer state oversight, standardized accounting procedures that made temple resources more transparent to royal officials, and personnel policies that prioritized competence and loyalty to state authority through traditional religious qualifications and hereditary status. Temple slaves found themselves working within institutions that were gradually being redefined according to imperial rather than purely Egyptian priorities. Some welcomed these changes as opportunities for advancement and improved working conditions, while others mourned the loss of traditional practices and social relationships that had provided meaning and stability within systems of bondage. Alexander's conquest and the establishment of Ptolemaic rule created more dramatic changes by introducing Greek legal concepts, administrative practices, and cultural values that were fundamentally incompatible with traditional Egyptian temple slavery. The Ptolemies weren't interested in eliminating Egyptian religious traditions, but they needed to integrate Egyptian institutions into a Mediterranean-wide economic and political system that operated according to different principles. Ptolemaic legal reforms gradually introduced concepts of individual legal rights, contractual labor relationships, and personal autonomy that couldn't be easily reconciled with hereditary bondage to religious institutions. These changes weren't implemented suddenly or comprehensively, but they created legal and cultural frameworks that made traditional temple slavery increasingly difficult to maintain and justify. The most significant changes occurred in how temple labor was organized and compensated. Ptolemaic administrators introduced wage payments for temple workers, contractual agreements that specified working conditions and terms of employment, and legal procedures that allowed workers to appeal administrative decisions and seek redress for mistreatment. These reforms didn't immediately eliminate temple slavery, but they created alternative arrangements that made traditional bondage less necessary and less attractive to both temple administrators and workers. Skilled temple workers could earn wages that provided better living standards than traditional slave arrangements, while temple administrators found that wage labor was often more productive and flexible than bound labor. Final major players in this transformation included Ptolemaic officials who were committed to administrative efficiency through traditional religious practices, Greek and Egyptian intellectuals who developed new theoretical frameworks for understanding labor and social organization, and temple slaves themselves who began asserting rights and making demands that would have been unthinkable under traditional arrangements. Last attempts to preserve traditional temple slavery included conservative religious movements that emphasized the spiritual importance of maintaining ancient practices, legal arguments that claimed royal authority to modify religious Institutions violated divine law, and economic analyses that attempted to demonstrate the practical benefits of traditional labor arrangements over foreign innovations. The dramatic final moments of temple slavery as a central Egyptian institution occurred during the Roman period, when Emperor Augustus implemented comprehensive administrative reforms that subjected all Egyptian institutions to Roman legal and administrative standards. These reforms didn't explicitly prohibit temple slavery, but they created legal frameworks that made such arrangements practically impossible to maintain. Gradual decline, rather than sudden elimination, characterized the actual end of temple slavery in most locations. Traditional arrangements persisted in some temples for decades or even centuries after they had been officially superseded, maintained by local custom, administrative inertia, and the practical difficulty of transforming institutional arrangements that had operated for centuries. Symbolic endpoints included the conversion of major temples to Christian or Islamic religious use, the final appointments of traditional Egyptian priests to positions of administrative authority, and the last recorded instances of hereditary temple service that continued family traditions of religious bondage that had persisted for generations. The end of Egyptian temple slavery resulted from the intersection of multiple factors that made traditional arrangements simultaneously less profitable, less justifiable, and less sustainable within changing historical circumstances. No single cause was sufficient to eliminate a system that had persisted for over a millennium, but the combination of external pressures and internal contradictions eventually made transformation inevitable. Internal problems included the accumulation of contradictions that had always existed within temple slavery, but became more apparent and problematic as Egyptian society became more sophisticated and complex. The gap between ideological justifications for human bondage and practical realities of institutional exploitation became increasingly difficult to ignore or rationalize as Egyptian intellectuals were exposed to alternative philosophical and legal frameworks. Economic inefficiencies that had been tolerable when Egypt was isolated and prosperous became unsustainable when Egypt faced international competition and fiscal pressures. Temple slavery had worked well in economic environments that prioritized stability and traditional arrangements over innovation and efficiency, but it was poorly adapted to competitive international markets that rewarded flexibility and responsiveness to changing conditions. External pressures included political incorporation into larger empires that operated according to different legal and administrative principles, economic integration into Mediterranean trade networks that required conformity with international business practices, and cultural exposure to foreign ideas about individual rights, social organization, and the proper relationship between religious and secular authority. The role of individuals versus historical forces created complex dynamics, where personal decisions by key players accelerated or delayed changes that were driven by larger historical developments. Some temple administrators, royal officials, and religious leaders actively promoted reforms that transformed traditional arrangements, while others resisted changes that seemed to threaten their institutional interests and personal beliefs. Foreign conquest was the most obvious external factor, but it wasn't sufficient by itself to eliminate temple slavery. The Persians, Greeks, and Romans all conquered Egypt without immediately abolishing traditional religious and labor arrangements. What mattered was the gradual integration of Egyptian institutions into larger political and economic systems that operated according to different principles. What could have been done differently is a fascinating counterfactual question that reveals how contingent the end of temple slavery actually was. Egyptian leaders could have attempted more comprehensive internal reforms that modernized temple operations while preserving traditional religious practices. But such reforms would have required acknowledging fundamental contradictions in Egyptian social organization that few people were prepared to confront directly. Alternative approaches might have included gradual voluntary manumission programs, economic reforms that provided temple slaves with wages and contractual rights while maintaining their religious obligations, or legal changes that transformed hereditary bondage into time-limited service contracts. Such reforms could have preserved essential religious functions while eliminating the most objectionable aspects of human bondage. The question of inevitability versus contingency remains debated among historians. Some argue that temple slavery was doomed by fundamental contradictions that would eventually have caused internal collapse, regardless of foreign conquest. Others contend that external conquest was the decisive factor, and that temple slavery could have persisted indefinitely under continued Egyptian independence. The most convincing analysis suggests that temple slavery was vulnerable to external pressure precisely because it contained internal contradictions that made adaptation to changing circumstances difficult and expensive. The system had worked well under stable historical conditions, but it lacked the flexibility needed to respond effectively to the rapid changes that characterized the ancient world's increasing interconnectedness. Modern parallels include various examples of institutional arrangements that seem stable and permanent until changing circumstances reveal their fundamental incompatibility with new economic, political, or cultural realities. The immediate aftermath of temple slavery's elimination was characterized by institutional confusion, economic disruption, and cultural uncertainty as Egyptian society attempted to replace arrangements that had been central to religious, economic, and social organization for over 1,000 years. The people who had been temple slaves found themselves legally free but practically unprepared for independence, while the institutions that had depended on their labor faced the challenge of reorganizing operations according to completely different principles. Who stepped into the vacuum created by temple slavery's elimination included Ptolemaic and Roman administrators who imposed foreign management techniques, entrepreneurial former slaves who established independent businesses using skills acquired during their bondage, and religious leaders who attempted to maintain traditional spiritual practices within new institutional frameworks that emphasized voluntary participation rather than compulsory service. Short-term consequences included economic disruption as temple operations were reorganized, social confusion as traditional hierarchies and relationships were replaced by new arrangements, and cultural uncertainty as religious practices that had been maintained by enslaved specialists were adapted for voluntary participants or professional clergy operating according to different principles. The most immediate practical problem was determining what to do with thousands of people whose entire lives had been structured around institutional bondage. Former temple slaves possessed valuable skills and knowledge, but they lacked experience with independent decision-making, personal financial management, and the social relationships that free people took for granted. Contemporary reactions varied, dramatically depending on people's positions within the traditional system and their attitudes toward institutional change. Some former slaves welcomed their liberation as an opportunity to pursue personal goals and interests that had been impossible under traditional arrangements. Others experienced freedom's abandonment by institutions that had provided security, meaning, and social identity within systems of bondage. Temple administrators and religious leaders faced the challenge of maintaining religious continuity while adapting to new legal and economic frameworks that required voluntary cooperation rather than compulsory service. Some embraced these changes as opportunities to purify religious practices by eliminating their association with human exploitation. Others mourned the loss of traditional arrangements that had seemed spiritually meaningful and institutionally effective. Attempts at revival or continuation included conservative religious movements that tried to maintain traditional practices within modified institutional frameworks, nostalgic cultural movements that idealized the stability and certainty of earlier periods, and practical efforts to preserve valuable techniques and knowledge that had been developed within temple slavery systems. The most significant immediate legacy was the demonstration that even the most established and seemingly permanent institutional arrangements could be transformed completely when sufficient pressure was applied consistently over extended periods. This lesson influenced later Egyptian responses to foreign rule, religious change, and social transformation by creating awareness that adaptation and innovation were necessary for institutional survival under changing historical circumstances. The transition period also created opportunities for innovation and experimentation that wouldn't have been possible within the constraints of traditional temple slavery, leading to new forms of religious practice, economic organization, and social relationship that incorporated valuable elements from Egyptian traditions while adapting to contemporary realities. The legacy of Egyptian temple slavery shaped later historical developments in ways that extended far beyond ancient Egypt's borders and continued long after the institution itself had disappeared. The organizational techniques, management strategies, and ideological frameworks developed by Egyptian temples influenced religious and economic institutions throughout the ancient world and provided models that were adapted, modified, and replicated by later civilizations facing similar challenges in organizing large-scale human labor. Specific influences on later developments included the Egyptian model of combining religious authority with economic power to create institutions that could command both spiritual loyalty and practical obedience. This template was studied and adapted by religious organizations throughout the Mediterranean world, from Greek mystery cults to Roman collegia to early Christian monasteries, all of which faced similar challenges in balancing spiritual mission with material necessity. Medieval European monasteries borrowed extensively from Egyptian temple management techniques, creating systems of religious labor that combined spiritual devotion with economic productivity in ways that consciously echoed Egyptian precedents. The monastic emphasis on lifetime commitment, hierarchical organization, and integration of prayer with work reflected Egyptian innovations in organizing human labor according to religious principles. How later generations viewed Egyptian temple slavery evolved significantly over time, changing cultural values and historical circumstances influenced people's understanding of what Egyptian civilization had achieved and what lessons should be drawn from its institutional arrangements. Early Christian writers often praised Egyptian religious devotion while condemning Egyptian exploitation of human labor, creating complex judgments that admired spiritual achievements while rejecting the methods used to accomplish them. Islamic scholars who encountered Egyptian temple slavery through historical records and architectural remains developed sophisticated analyses of how religious institutions could accumulate temporal power and wealth, using Egyptian examples to support arguments about the proper relationship between spiritual authority and worldly responsibility. Their discussions influenced later Islamic approaches to organizing religious institutions and managing religious economies. European colonial administrators in the 19th and 20th centuries sometimes explicitly referenced Egyptian temple slavery as a model for organizing indigenous labor in ways that seemed both economically efficient and culturally respectful. These colonial applications of Egyptian precedents created new forms of exploitation that combined ancient techniques with modern technologies and legal frameworks. Myths versus realities that developed around Egyptian temple slavery reflected broader cultural attitudes toward ancient Egyptian civilization and its relationship to later historical developments. Popular culture often romanticized Egyptian temple slavery as mysterious religious practice performed by devoted believers, while academic scholarship revealed the practical economic and political functions that made religious devotion profitable for institutional authorities. The persistence of Egyptian influence was particularly evident in how later civilizations approached the challenge of organizing skilled labor for large-scale cultural and religious projects. The techniques developed by Egyptian temples for training, motivating, and retaining skilled workers influenced everything from medieval cathedral construction to Renaissance artistic workshops to modern corporate human resources management. Why Egyptian temple slavery remained important to later generations was partly its demonstration that sophisticated civilizations could achieve remarkable cultural accomplishments through systematic exploitation of human potential, creating uncomfortable questions about the relationship between cultural achievement and social justice that remain relevant to contemporary discussions about institutional power and human dignity. The institutional innovations developed within Egyptian temple slavery also provided practical solutions to organizational challenges that recurred throughout history whenever large institutions needed to coordinate complex operations using human labor. The Egyptian model of combining hierarchical authority, ideological motivation, and practical incentives created templates for institutional management that proved remarkably durable and adaptable to different cultural contexts. Academic study of Egyptian temple slavery has revealed how seemingly exotic historical arrangements often reflected universal human responses to fundamental challenges in organizing social cooperation, economic production, and cultural meaning within systems of unequal power and authority. Today, we can see echoes of Egyptian temple slavery in various contemporary institutions and arrangements that combine ideological commitment, economic dependency, and limited individual autonomy in ways that create similar tensions between institutional benefits and personal freedom. These parallels aren't exact equivalents. Modern legal frameworks and cultural values create different constraints and possibilities, but the underlying dynamics often reflect patterns that were first systematized in ancient Egyptian temples. Corporate employment in certain industries creates relationships where employees become so specialized and institutionally dependent that leaving becomes practically impossible despite formal legal freedom. Technology workers, whose skills are valuable only within specific corporate ecosystems, academic researchers whose careers depend on institutional affiliations, and professionals whose licenses and credentials tie them to particular organizational contexts sometimes find themselves in situations that echo the psychological and practical constraints that define temple slavery. The modern parallels become particularly striking in cases where corporations provide comprehensive benefits, housing, healthcare, education, social activities, that create total institutional environments similar to ancient temple complexes. company towns, corporate campuses, and institutional communities that provide for all aspects of employees' lives can create dependencies that limit individual autonomy, even when formal legal freedom exists. Military service represents another area where modern institutions echo Egyptian temple slavery through lifetime commitments, comprehensive institutional control over daily routines, ideological frameworks that make service seem spiritually meaningful, and hierarchical advancement systems that provide limited opportunities for improvement within systems that don't permit independent departure. Religious institutions, particularly those that require lifetime vows or comprehensive lifestyle commitments, obviously parallel Egyptian temple slavery in their combination of spiritual authority, economic control, and restrictions on individual autonomy. Modern monasteries, religious communities, and spiritual organizations that require total commitment often struggle with similar tensions between institutional mission and individual dignity that characterized ancient Egyptian temples. Academic institutions, especially elite universities and research organizations, sometimes create career dependencies that echo temple slavery through tenure systems, institutional prestige hierarchies, and specialized knowledge that has value primarily within academic contexts. Scholars who spend decades developing expertise that makes them valuable to institutions while limiting their options for independent careers face choices similar to those confronted by skilled temple slaves. What hasn't changed about human nature is revealed in how people respond to institutional arrangements that provide security and meaning while limiting autonomy and choice. The psychological strategies that temple slaves developed for maintaining dignity and agency within oppressive systems, finding meaning in work, building informal social networks, exercising limited forms of resistance, creating personal spaces within institutional constraints, remain visible in contemporary institutional settings. Similar patterns in different contexts include the tendency for institutions to use ideological frameworks to justify arrangements that primarily benefit institutional authorities, the development of internal hierarchies that provide limited advancement opportunities within systems that don't permit genuine independence, and the creation of comprehensive institutional environments that make alternatives to institutional participation seem impossible or undesirable. The persistence of these patterns suggests that Egyptian temple slavery wasn't just an artifact of ancient cultural values or primitive legal systems, but rather reflected fundamental tensions between individual autonomy and institutional cooperation that continue to influence how modern societies organize large-scale human activities. Contemporary issues that echo Egyptian temple slavery include debates about corporate power and worker autonomy, discussions about the proper relationship between religious authority and individual freedom, concerns about institutional control over professional careers and personal lives, and questions about whether comprehensive institutional benefits justify restrictions on individual choice and mobility. The most uncomfortable modern parallel would be how contemporary institutions use sophisticated psychological and material incentives to create voluntary compliance with arrangements that would seem obviously exploitative, imposed through overt coercion. Egyptian temples pioneered techniques for making systematic exploitation seem personally beneficial and spiritually meaningful, creating models that remain influential in contemporary institutional design. Understanding these parallels doesn't require condemning all contemporary institutional arrangements as equivalent to ancient slavery, but it does suggest the importance of maintaining critical awareness about how institutional power operates on what costs individuals pay for institutional benefits and security. Even now, Egyptian temple slavery influences various aspects of contemporary life through its contributions to institutional design, management theory, and cultural understanding of how organizations can combine material benefits with ideological commitment to create comprehensive systems of human cooperation and control. Academic study of Egyptian temple slavery has become important for understanding institutional power, organizational psychology, and the historical development of management techniques that remain influential in contemporary corporate and institutional settings. Business schools teach case studies based on Egyptian temple management as examples of early organizational innovation and institutional design. Popular culture continues to reference Egyptian temple slavery through movies, novels, and entertainment that often distort historical realities while perpetuating cultural fascination with ancient Egyptian institutional arrangements. These popular representations influence contemporary understanding of religious authority, institutional power, and the relationship between spiritual commitment and material exploitation. Political discourse increasingly references Egyptian temple slavery as a historical example relevant to contemporary debates about corporate power, religious authority, and institutional control over individual lives. Politicians, activists, and commentators use Egyptian precedents to support arguments about everything from corporate responsibility to religious freedom to workers' rights. Social movements that challenge institutional power and advocate for individual autonomy often reference Egyptian temple slavery as a historical example of how sophisticated civilizations can systematically exploit human potential while maintaining ideological legitimacy. These references help contemporary activists articulate concerns about modern institutional arrangements that echo ancient patterns of organized exploitation. Why people still care about Egyptian temple slavery reflects continuing concerns about institutional power, individual autonomy, and the proper relationship between collective benefits and personal freedom. Contemporary societies face similar challenges in organizing large-scale cooperation while preserving individual dignity and choice, making Egyptian precedents relevant to ongoing political and social debates. The influence also extends to academic disciplines including organizational psychology, management theory, religious studies, and labor history, all of which draw on Egyptian temple slavery as a case study in institutional design, human motivation, and the historical development of organizational techniques that remain relevant to contemporary institutional challenges. Legal scholars studying corporate law, employment relationships, and institutional liability often reference Egyptian temple slavery as an early example of comprehensive institutional control over human resources, providing historical context for contemporary legal frameworks governing employer-employee relationships and institutional responsibility. Educational institutions use Egyptian temple slavery as a teaching tool for exploring ethical questions about institutional power, individual autonomy, and social responsibility that remain central to contemporary debates about everything from corporate governance to university administration to religious institutional authority. The continuing relevance of Egyptian temple slavery reflects its demonstration of fundamental tensions between individual freedom and collective organization that every society must address through institutional arrangements that balance competing values and interests. Modern societies continue to struggle with questions that ancient Egyptians addressed through temple slavery. How can institutions motivate excellent performance, while respecting human dignity? How can collective benefits be achieved without sacrificing individual autonomy? How can ideological commitment be fostered without creating exploitative dependencies? These questions remain central to contemporary discussions about institutional design, making Egyptian temple slavery an enduring source of historical insights into challenges that transcend particular cultural contexts or historical periods. The Egyptian experience provides both cautionary examples of how institutional arrangements can become exploitative and practical insights into techniques for organizing large-scale human cooperation that remain valuable when applied with appropriate respect for individual rights and dignity. Looking back across more than 1,000 years of Egyptian temple slavery, we've seen how a system that began as religious devotion evolved into one of history's most sophisticated examples of institutionalized human exploitation disguised as spiritual service. The major themes that emerged from our exploration reveal patterns that remain uncomfortably relevant to contemporary discussions about institutional power, individual autonomy, and the price of collective achievement. We began with the daily routine of Khaemwaset, a temple scribe whose comfortable life within bondage illustrated the complex contradictions that define temple slavery. People who lived better than many free citizens while being denied fundamental human autonomy. His morning awakening to temple bells symbolized how individual lives were structured around institutional needs that combined genuine religious purpose with systematic economic exploitation. Key patterns that emerged included the sophisticated management techniques that Egyptian temples developed for maximizing human productivity while maintaining ideological legitimacy. The temples pioneered organizational innovations that combined material incentives, spiritual meaning, and social hierarchy to create comprehensive systems of human cooperation that served institutional interests while providing individual benefits that made exploitation seem personally advantageous. The most surprising discoveries centered on how thoroughly temple slavery was integrated into Egyptian civilization's greatest achievements. The art, architecture, literature, and technological innovations that we admire as expressions of ancient Egyptian genius were produced largely by people who had no choice about their participation and no control over how their talents were used. This creates uncomfortable questions about the relationship between cultural achievements and human freedom that extend far beyond ancient Egypt. The institutional conflicts we explored, particularly the crisis under Ramesses III and the revolution under Akhenaten, revealed how systems that seem stable and permanent can contain internal contradictions that create sudden crises and dramatic transformations. These episodes demonstrated that even the most established arrangements of power and authority tingent and adaptable when sufficient pressure is applied consistently over time. How our understanding evolved throughout this exploration reflects the complexity of making moral judgments about historical arrangements that don't fit neatly into contemporary categories of right and wrong. Temple slavery was simultaneously oppressive and beneficial, exploitative and meaningful, harmful and productive in ways that resist simple moral conclusions, while providing important insights into the human capacity for adaptation, resistance, and survival within systematic oppression. The human stories we encountered, from Khaemwaset's bureaucratic competence to Tanetjerit's artistic excellence to Panab's passive resistance, illustrated how individual agency and dignity can persist even within systems designed to eliminate personal autonomy. These stories remind us that institutional arrangements, however comprehensive and powerful, are ultimately implemented by individuals whose choices and responses shape how systems actually operate in practice. The transformation and eventual end of temple slavery demonstrated how changing historical circumstances can make seemingly permanent institutional arrangements obsolete, but also how the techniques and patterns developed within oppressive systems can influence later institutional design in ways that perpetuate similar dynamics under different legal and cultural frameworks. Let me leave you with one final story that encapsulates everything we've discussed about the complexities, contradictions, and human costs of temple slavery in ancient Egypt. This story comes from the very end of the Ptolemaic period, when traditional Egyptian institutions were being transformed by foreign rule and cultural change. But when the psychological and social patterns established during centuries of temple slavery continued to influence how people understood their relationships to institutions and authority. Her name was Isitemkeb, and she was the last in a family line that had served the temple of Amun at Thebes for over 20 generations. By the time of her birth, around 100 BCE, temple slavery as a legal institution was already being replaced by wage labor and contractual relationships. But Isitemkeb's family had continued to live and work at the temple according to traditional arrangements that no longer had legal force, but retained powerful cultural and psychological significance. Isitemkeb had been trained from childhood in the complex religious rituals, administrative procedures, and craft techniques that her ancestors had performed as enslaved temple workers. She possessed knowledge and skills that represented centuries of accumulated expertise, making her one of the last people who understood how traditional Egyptian temple operations had actually functioned at the most detailed, practical level. When Ptolemaic administrators offered her family the opportunity to formalize their status as free wage workers with contractual rights and legal protections, Isitemkeb faced a choice that symbolized the broader transformation occurring throughout Egyptian society. She could accept legal freedom and economic opportunity that would allow her to use her talents independently, or she could maintain traditional arrangements that provided less legal protection but more cultural continuity and spiritual meaning. The choice wasn't simply between freedom and bondage, because by this point the practical differences between her traditional status and the new contractual arrangements were minimal. Instead, it was a choice between different ways of understanding her relationship to work, community, and meaning. The traditional arrangements connected her to ancestral traditions and religious practices that had provided her family with identity and purpose for centuries. The new arrangements offered individual autonomy and economic opportunity, but required abandoning cultural patterns that had defined her family's understanding of their place in the world. Isitemkeb's decision reveals something important about how people respond to historical change and institutional transformation. She chose to maintain traditional arrangements, not because she was opposed to freedom or afraid of independence, but because the traditional relationships provided forms of meaning and connection that the new arrangements couldn't replicate, even though they offered greater legal protection and economic opportunity. Her choice also illustrates how historical change creates psychological costs that aren't captured in simple narratives about progress from oppression to freedom. The transformation of temple slavery into wage labor eliminated systematic exploitation and provided new opportunities for individual advancement, but it also destroyed social relationships and cultural traditions that had helped people find meaning and purpose within oppressive systems. Isitemkeb continued working at the temple according to traditional principles until her death around 50 BCE, maintaining religious practices and social relationships that connected her to centuries of family tradition, while the legal and economic frameworks that had originally justified those traditions gradually disappeared around her. Her story reminds us that institutional transformation, even when it eliminates oppressive arrangements and creates new opportunities for human flourishing, involves losses and costs that are often experienced most acutely by the people who are supposedly being liberated. Understanding these costs doesn't mean opposing beneficial changes, but it does mean recognizing the full human complexity of historical transformation. Why this story encapsulates our broader themes is that it shows how individual choices about institutional relationships reflect deeper questions about meaning, identity, and belonging that transcend simple calculations about material benefit and legal status. What connects us across thousands of years to people like Khaemwaset, Isitemkeb, and the countless others whose names we'll never know is the fundamental human challenge of finding dignity, meaning, and agency within institutional arrangements that we didn't choose and can't completely control. Their experiences remind us that the relationship between individual autonomy and collective organization remains one of humanity's most persistent and complex challenges. The temple bells that called Egyptian slaves to their daily duties have long since fallen silent, but the tensions they symbolized between institutional needs and individual desires continue to resonate in contemporary discussions about corporate power, religious authority, educational institutions, and social organization. We may have different legal frameworks and cultural values, but we still struggle with questions about how much individual autonomy we're willing to sacrifice for collective benefits and institutional security. The sophisticated management techniques that Egyptian temples developed for motivating human performance while maintaining institutional control have evolved and spread throughout modern organizational culture in ways that make ancient precedents surprisingly relevant to contemporary experience. The psychological strategies that temple slaves used to maintain dignity and agency within oppressive systems remain visible in how people navigate institutional relationships today. Perhaps most importantly, the Egyptian experience reminds us that the price of ignoring or dismissing concerns about institutional power and individual autonomy is the risk of creating systems that systematically exploit human potential while maintaining ideological legitimacy. The Egyptians created one of history's most impressive civilizations, partly through institutional arrangements that were simultaneously beneficial and oppressive, productive and exploitative, meaningful and harmful. Their legacy isn't just the monuments and artifacts that survive in museums, but also the institutional techniques and organizational patterns that continue to influence how societies organize large-scale human cooperation. Understanding this legacy doesn't require condemning everything the ancient Egyptians accomplished, but it does suggest the importance of maintaining critical awareness about how institutional power operates and what costs individuals pay for collective achievements. The gentle morning light that once awakened temple slaves to begin another day of service has been replaced by alarm clocks that call modern workers to their own institutional obligations. But the fundamental questions about human dignity, individual autonomy, and collective responsibility remain as relevant today as they were when Egyptian civilization was at its height. As we turn off our devices and return to our own daily routines within institutions that provide us with security, meaning, and opportunity, while also constraining our choices and shaping our possibilities, we might remember that the human capacity for adaptation, resistance, and survival within complex institutional arrangements is one of our species' most remarkable and enduring characteristics. The story of Egyptian temple slavery ultimately reminds us that individual dignity and agency can persist even within the most comprehensive systems of institutional control, and that understanding historical patterns of exploitation and resistance can help us navigate contemporary challenges with greater wisdom and awareness. Sweet dreams, and may your own morning bells call you to work that honors both your individual humanity and your collective responsibilities.